Hey, hey everyone, it's Naomi Wolf, and this is the fifth or sixth of the Step 10 videos. Let me know if you can hear me. This is the fifth or sixth of the Step 10 of 10 Steps to Fascism videos that I've been producing as a way to help you understand the moment that we're in, the crisis that we're in, and help you understand the dangers that you may not fully understand because they're not being explained well in mainstream media. So something I've been writing about, many of you know, recently is the huge story. Let me know if you can hear me. The huge story that um, Google, Microsoft, Palantir, which is owned by a far right-wing billionaire named Peter Thiel, and Amazon have bought up all of the NHS, or rather been given the contracts, been paid to produce, to manage, to monetize, to transmit, to communicate all of the NHS, National Health Service in Britain, and the HHS, Health and Human Services in the US, COVID data. So this is incredibly important. I have spoken about yesterday about how when you have a digital platform, especially if a third party for-profit is managing the data, and someone please let me know that you can hear me, okay? And I'll keep talking, just give me a comment that you can hear me. It it allows any kind of story to be told to consumers of that information on what we in the digital data world call the front end, because you can do anything with that data on the back end and not even be lying. So it creates, when Palantir and Google and Microsoft are handed the contracts to give you information about how many people have died of COVID in Britain or in America, in what state, in what town, let me know you can hear me, and when they are managing the data, I'm telling you that there is no longer any ability for you to confirm the data. And this is, even though we're in the middle of this pandemic and it's extremely urgent, and to me as a journalist and as a citizen, the fact that you can't make good decisions anymore now that this has happened about your health or your family's health, whether to go back to school, whether to go back to work, whether to throw a dinner party, based on these data, these COVID maps that the news are reproducing without checking the data sets. This is the biggest deal we are facing as humanity right now, because as I said in my last video, the billionaires who run these data tech companies can use their knowledge of the data or their manipulation of the data. And again, I'm going to show you why I mean not even lying, right? Just deciding how they present it to you to drive economies up or down, to advance agendas of special interests who have a hand in crafting COVID responses, and to deliver various other outcomes. I'm a little concerned because no one is telling me that they can hear me, but I will just forge ahead and hope that someone will write in that you can hear me. All right, so especially urgent to understand this because there's more and more brutal lockdown going on in countries around the world. We had communications from Melbourne, Australia, that in Melbourne, people are inside their homes 22 hours a day, and that the lockdown is managed by police and bypassing the state legislators. We have reports that we are confirming that in Ontario, police are, bursting into people's homes without a warrant to check that they are not having more than a specific number of people in their homes. And I, as a New Yorker, am, very concerned. Peter Nash says, I can hear you. Thank you, Naomi. Great. Thank you. Can you hear me? Let me know if you can hear me clearly. I am very concerned about this trend all over the world because I saw in yesterday's paper and this morning's paper that my former mayor, Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City, has announced, after New York was doing well and people were moving around, some people were going back to work. Yes, people are wearing masks as they should and social distancing, but there were no restrictions on movement. I read to my great concern today that Bill de Blasio has identified several hot spots in Queens and in Brooklyn, and that he's targeting these with lockdown, new restrictions. And I can't stress enough as a political consultant how much it worries me. And I'm trying to explain to you how it should worry you when you start to hear the same phrases over and over, because that's how politics works when they're rolling out a campaign, right? That's called messaging. So I'm reading in the UK that the news is that they're identifying hot spots, and the UK has used the phrase lockdown for some time. In Australia, they may have identified hot spots. In Australia, I was told there are only 3 big supermarkets that you can buy from, called the Big Three in Victoria. We're seeing the same thing in New York State, that there are only certain essential businesses that are allowed to stay open. They're Amazon, they're Walmart, even though theoretically these are more dangerous than the mom and pop stores that are being allowed to close, to die, are being crushed. And so and lockdown has not been a phrase that's been used in the U.S. We were on pause. We have First Amendment freedoms of assembly here. So it's a very big deal that the New York City governor has started to use the phrase lockdown, which is really characteristic, as one of my essays and videos explains, not of a free society, but of a police state. I'm a little concerned that these videos that have had thousands and thousands and thousands of views show no comment at all right now, but I'll just keep talking, except for Peter. I'll just keep talking. The reason this is concerning is that you see these days, especially, policies are being tried out in country number 1, and then country number 2 will learn from it, often the same group of political consultants advising Boris Johnson and Bolsonaro and Trump, and the right-wing leadership in Australia, and so they all start to do the same things. So it's very worrying, and to use the same phrases, right? And you saw that in the War on Terror. So I looked more closely at what regions are being targeted for lockdown, and what is it going to look like in New York? Very distressing. It's going to look like restrictions on movement, schools closing, but also certain businesses closing, being forced to close, and certain businesses being allowed to stay open. And again, we know from experience now that what that does is kill small businesses. About 50% of the small businesses in New York have closed. You see it. Other statistics are 1 in 6, but you literally see nothing but huge chains left now in New York City. All these entrepreneurs, all these restaurants, all these mom and pop stores have closed. So when you target a neighborhood of New York with lockdown, as opposed to more testing, more PPE, more resources, campaigns to social distance, voluntary measures, like with every pandemic, every epidemic in free societies for hundreds of years, right, since the Black Plague, then what you're going to have is targeted closures of businesses and other economic outcomes. I explained how, in my last video 2 days ago, how when you get a policy about coronavirus or anything, even though it's represented as a transparent mirror of the crisis, it's not. It goes through many, many hands of donors, special interests, big corporations, lobbyists, changing the way it plays out, tweaking it, you know, putting in their outcomes and their agendas. So again, who got the contracts for handling COVID data in the by the NHS and by HHS? One of those companies is Amazon. Who benefits when a neighborhood or a nation is locked down and cannot go to the store, cannot go to the post office easily to mail a package, can't shop at a local hardware store or local bookstore? Amazon. So for Amazon to know in advance what coronavirus statistics are, or to be in an affiliation or communication with Google, Microsoft, and Palantir, who know what the coronavirus statistics are going to be before they're released, right? Because of the manipulations that you can do without lying with a digital news site or digital platform, Amazon can profit vastly. And we've seen Jeff Bezos earning billions of dollars more than his existing billions since the pandemic. You've seen other tech billionaires earning billions more since the pandemic. So when Google, Microsoft, Palantir, and Amazon are producing coronavirus statistics, they can know in advance what to invest in, where to buy real estate, you know, where to move up supply chains so that they can grab a gigantic chunk of the economy that they now don't have. And they can also, as I've said many times, let their small circle of friends know what the coronavirus data is going to look like in advance, so that those 6 or 12 billionaires can legally engage in insider trading, hedge the economy, short the economy. It's called short and distort, and make a fortune. So now going to the details of who is going to close. Maybe it's purely medical, that it happens to be neighborhoods in Brooklyn that are like Williamsburg and Park Slope and other neighborhoods in Brooklyn just past those already gentrified neighborhoods that are much coveted by real estate interests to gentrify. Maybe it's purely medical, and there's some basis for this. Those also happen to be neighborhoods, and I'm Jewish, in which large Orthodox Jewish communities live, and they are having big crowded community events. So it may be that there's a purely medical reason for those areas being about to be locked down. However, additionally, Bill de Blasio is the guy of the developers. That's who got him in. That's who he serves. Those neighborhoods are also completely coveted by the people who turned Williamsburg into a hipster heaven with $4,000 rents from what had been a modest working class community. The people who own a great deal of property in those neighborhoods that are going to be locked down are members of the Orthodox Jewish community. 20 years ago, they began investing as a community in real estate in their neighborhoods, and now they're major landlords. What is going to happen when you lock down those neighborhoods and not Manhattan, where the rich folks live, right? Not the West Village, that's not being locked down. The Upper East Side is not being locked down. Well, what's going to happen is those small businesses that right now pay rents to those Orthodox Jewish communities who own those properties, they're going to go out of business. And the renters who are living there, they're not going to be able to pay their rent. They're going to be evicted. Even if there's a moratorium on evictions, sooner or later, the bottom will drop out of those economies, and those properties' prices will collapse. It will be a buyer's market. And at that point, the people who are not the Orthodox Jewish community landlords, the people who are the big institutional real estate investors who got Bill de Blasio into office, who have not been able to crack that market because it's held by, substantially by the Orthodox Jewish community, they will be able to get in there and scoop up properties at rock bottom prices. And then when the pandemic ends, when we can go back to work, which again, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and Palantir will tell us, right? It's not an NHS decision now, not an HHS decision about how that data is presented, then it's going to skyrocket. They'll be renovated, put back on the market at $6,000 a month. So you can't tell for sure that lobbying went on behind the scenes, but the trouble with Google, Palantir, Microsoft, and Amazon providing the data for coronavirus information is that the article in the New York Times that told us that these areas are going to lock down and that some businesses will be deemed essential and they'll survive, which is straight up totalitarianism, right? It's straight up fascism, a centrally planned economy in which an oligarch says, you can live and you have to die economically, right? That is straight up not a democracy. It's not even capitalism, right? It's a police state. It's a thug economy. The people who provided the data that the New York Times cited, the New York Times didn't link to the data. It simply reported what Bill de Blasio announced, which is that instead of 3%, it's 8% positives in those neighborhoods. What does that mean? What does that mean? You can't click through even on the digital New York Times to see the data sets, the raw data that the New York Times is using to make that very impactful declaration that is going to end the businesses, crush the dreams, create isolation, hunger, starvation, unemployment for thousands of people in certain neighborhoods of New York City. You cannot check it for yourself. You can't check it. You can't check it because they don't link to it, and you can't check it. They randomly say it's, the New York City Health Department, but they don't show you the raw data. And you can't know if the New York City Health Department has now made a contract with some data provider to produce that data and deliver it to the New York Times, which, as I've been explaining, can thus be altered in any number of ways because of how it's presented. So now very briefly, so I've given you a big sketch of why this is so extraordinarily dangerous, right? That people are being locked down, unable to visit their relatives. And I'm not a doctor. It's a real pandemic. There are real health concerns that in a free society, communities deal with the way we dealt with AIDS without locking up HIV positive people and isolating them from the rest of the community, not letting them touch anyone because it might lead to, sexual contact, right? There were sensible things to be done. We lost many people, but we did not lose liberties, and the community drove the public health response. That's how we should be running a crisis in a real democracy. So now I'm going to explain a little bit, and I want to ask you to bear with me, about how digital third-party platforms can lie to you about anything, and why it's so extraordinarily dangerous that that the coronavirus data has been handed to these for-profits. So I'm just going to read to you a little bit from an essay I wrote about erasures of history, right? Because this grab of coronavirus data by these big companies, well, they didn't grab it from Boris Johnson, he handed it over, Trump handed it over, but it's not in isolation. It's not just government records about coronavirus that have been scooped up by big tech in a way that is creating kind of a matrix in which people will no longer be able to check for themselves if they should send their child to school, or remember history, or consult archives or records for themselves. And so I'm just going to read you a little bit of how databases are being snapped up by for-profit companies, rendering them much less accountable than they used to be, when it was literally your local library and government records, or Health and Human Services and government records, and it was straight to you, the consumer, or the New York Times, citing government records, right? There's an incredible slippage going on right now that you have to understand. So corporate government funding of research databases and the growth of private paywalls. So this is about databases in general, all right? Few researchers, and bear with me, it's nerdy, but it's important, and I'm going to explain it in as clear language as I can possibly explain it, because you need to understand this, and you need to share this with people so you will not be manipulated, so you will not be herded like animals without asking, what is the source? What's the quality of that record? Who owns that record, okay? Few researchers or citizens understand that there can now be many layers of slippage between the content of public records like medical records or COVID test records, physical libraries or public health archives, and the databases or hubs that are produced digitally by big tech companies. And since I began my research on my most recent book, Outrages, there have become many new barriers to citizens and researchers in the form of corporate paywalls that are digitizing content. Both corporatization and government funding can affect access and content. So one of the examples that I give is that government historical archives are being bought up by third parties, right? And so instead of libraries where you can physically go look up the proceedings of the Old Bailey, my book, Outrages, initially got the impression that there were many fewer prosecutions for sodomy than there actually were, because I was consulting a government-funded digital database, but the database wasn't the same as the archives at the Old Bailey. Okay, there had been slippage created by digitization. And so what happened was scholars like Charles Upchurch and H.G. Cox and Graham Robb found thousands of committals for same-sex offenses in the 19th century and dozens of executions for sodomy, whereas the digitized records turn up like 4 executions for sodomy and a couple of dozen arrests, depending on how you search. So that's just one example. It's not about coronavirus, but it's about history. But you could fill in coronavirus, you could fill in any public records at all. The problems raised for scholarship of public records databases being bought up by overseas for-profit companies is not restricted to this example. And more independently curated and formerly public research or medical or government archives, like COVID test data archives, are being purchased by private companies and are being monetized by paywalls or by advertising or by selling the data. This changes the nature of the access to knowledge in various ways. And this is happening at universities. For example, in 2012, the British Library used to be the custodian of paper newspapers that I searched digitally for my thesis. But after 2012, those same periodicals were bought up from the British Library by ProQuest, which is a private American company. ProQuest is not a public academic database run by scholars, archivists, or librarians. Rather, ProQuest LLC is an Ann Arbor, Michigan-based infotech company with many data holdings, including databases for pharmaceutical data and for patents. And I'm asking you to pay attention to this because this vacuuming up of data by companies like ProQuest, Microsoft, Google, Palantir is focused on medical data as well as historical data, archival data. ProQuest's role as a for-profit company rather than a public archive was illustrated vividly when it was fined by the SEC in America in 2008 for committing securities fraud. Do you see where I'm going? And overstating its annual revenue by 31%. But again, let me alert you to this. If ProQuest owns pharmaceutical data and data for patents, and ProQuest owns newspapers. And ProQuest can buy up from the NHS coronavirus test data. Then ProQuest can invest or build its business in a complete spiral where it can heighten or hype or maximize, test data about people testing positive for coronavirus, and also buy up data that people who are creating a patent for a vaccine will need to have, right? So they have a vested interest in what the data looks like in reporting about COVID to you if they buy those data sets. Significantly, this will blow your mind, ProQuest acquired from LexisNexis the Congressional Information Service, an important archive of U.S. legislative content, a U.S. national security database, and this for-profit American company has also acquired the UK Parliamentary Papers, which is the record of annual reports to Parliament of criminal convictions. So I just want to give you a moment for your head to explode. One American company owns the data sets people will need in creating a vaccine. They own the data sets if they buy COVID data, like Microsoft, Google, Palantir have done, actually been given COVID data, the data to create an absolute panic in a complete society. They own history because they own back records of British newspapers, and you can be sure they're buying American newspapers at some point as well. And they own the data that archives U.S. legislative content. So they own institutional memory. These are the records that reveal, among other historical insights, how extensively many kinds of events unfolded in the past. Another British Library archive of periodicals, 19th century British newspapers, is now licensed to users by Cengage Learning Holdings II Inc., which is also a private American company based in Independence, Kentucky. Cengage Learning Holdings II Inc. specializes in digital products related to education and libraries and boasts an international board with backgrounds in heavily profitable digital data such as data from health sciences, rather than with backgrounds in education or library studies. Cengage in turn owns Gale, a subset of this company. Cengage's 2018 annual report shows revenue of $1.461.2 million and adjusted net profit of approximately, so that's over $1 billion, and an adjusted net profit of approximately $298.5 million in that 1 year alone. So this platform has taken what has been for free in libraries in America, and now it licenses that information for $119.99 a year for an unlimited student subscription. So this paywall gives students who can afford this expense access to knowledge that when these documents were held by public libraries and even university libraries, or were digital public resources owned by the British Library or the Library of Congress, they used to be open and free for all. So you get what happened. All these documents, which used to be readily available in public in libraries or archives, are now, a paywall is around them by Cengage. Cengage, which holds access to public archives and educational data and curricula for students, also profits from medical data. You see the complete circle. So Cengage's annual report makes clear that the company's mission is not educational, but naturally enough profit-driven by monetizing content as quickly as possible and on the greatest possible scale. So this mission is appropriate for an investor-held company, but it is a mission which may be invisible to scholarly researchers or to citizens or to students who assume that the format and branding of the database, which cites the British Library, means that they are dealing with an impartial digital public resource in the custodianship of an educationally oriented public entity. But a private for-profit company, and this is what I really want you to understand, as opposed to a public library or a public archive or a government health agency or Health and Human Services or the NHS has no moral or fiscal obligation to deliver comprehensiveness of search results, to deliver data in any way whatsoever, so it can mislead you with data presentation, or any obligation to deliver historical impartiality or even thoroughness. They can do whatever they want with the data. I'll go on, I'll stop there with this part of the essay because it's a lot to absorb, but I want to take it back now to the issue of you and coronavirus and the maps that you see, the news that you get saying, oh my God, there are spikes, there are hotspots. There may be, but the people who are reporting that to you now have no obligation to report it to you correctly. I'm going to say that again. When it was NHS, when it was HHS, they had a legal obligation to tell you the truth and make those transparent public records available to you. But one reason governments who are trying to manage citizens and make deals with big corporations without including citizens like to hand over records like COVID test data to third parties like Google and Microsoft and Palantir and Amazon is so that they can get around the obligation to tell you the truth. Those entities have no obligation to tell you the truth. And in fact, they have a contrary obligation by law. Their obligation is to maximize profits to their shareholders. They can be sued if they don't do that, whereas a government official can be sued if they violate their legal obligations. So what that means is that Amazon has no obligation to represent spikes in coronavirus accurately, neither does Microsoft or Google or Palantir. Their obligation is to make the most money out of you as they can to deliver value to their shareholders. So they have to use COVID data to make sure there are great supply chains for Amazon and not for the mom and pop stores, or to make sure that they are holding all of the medical data so that when there's a vaccine, they're the ones who cash out with that $1 trillion in profit, or to hype, fears or a sense of hotspots in certain places so as to make sure that their curricula, their digital curricula are being used and schools are closed down to deliver value to their shareholders. So that's all I have to say about this. It's a lot. I hope you understand it. I hope you understand how important it is to understand it. I hope you will now ask questions. I'm concerned that we don't have any questions coming in. I hope that the algorithm is not dialing me down because, again, these videos have been very, very viral. But I'm going to stop there and wish you well and wish you, questions and skepticism and hope that you take this information I've given you and use it to inform your neighbors, to not be passive, to not be docile. Take care of your health, take care of the health of your community, but do not be pushed around because you are not being told the truth now in coronavirus maps if there is any intermediation by any for-profit company. And now there is. So that's it for me. The book, and I'm asking you to buy it, please, is Outrages, Sex, Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love. It is a prequel to where we are now. It shows you how we got to the point where the state believes that it can manage our lives and our minds and our history and our bodies. And also The End of America is a book I wrote that should be read as what happened after Outrages. So the one that's just coming out now is Outrages. Please order it. If you want me to send you an inscribed book plate, I will. I'm asking you sincerely to support the book and my publisher, Chelsea Green and Independent Publishing, because this war on ideas is also a war on influencers and independent thought and independent publishing. So I really do need your support, and so do they. So rush out and get a copy, please. And if you can become members of Daily Clout, that's the platform I use to help me research these videos, to help me explain what's going on in these blogs, and to bring you transparent, legislation so that you don't have people spinning in line to either. So again, that's Daily Clout, and the book is Outrageous. Thank you so much. Be safe and well, and please share this because it looks like I'm not sure how many people are present at this live video. Thank you. Bye-bye.